Hello and welcome back to Portrait of an Editor. In part 2 of my conversation with Andy Khouri, Andy and I finish up discussing his take on editing Green Arrow. Also, we discuss how he learned to navigate the politics of the DC offices and the tastes of his bosses. Finally, we talk about the early days of the Black Label imprint and its objectives and how they were revised as the imprint moved forward. In Addendum 2, Andy talks about the creative folks a reader never really hears about and the responsibilities of an editor. Enjoy.
Creatively, as a DC editor, my first sort of process is to think, because you're assigned characters for the most part. At least back then you were. You don't necessarily invent things from whole cloth. Maybe you do now. I do think editors at DC now have more creative initiative than they were ever allowed to have in the last, certainly 17, 20 years or so. And I think that you see that in line. But for me, I would be given a book like Green Arrow, for example, which is a character I didn't have a lot of affection for. I didn't dislike Green Arrow. It was just not one of those characters I ever really got into. And you get given this task, and you think, like, this character was created today. What would you push forward? What would come to the surface of the character, of the take, and through that process, through that sort of critical thinking process and talking with the writer, I was very lucky, because many times editors at the time I was there don't get to choose all the creators on their books. And I inherited the writer Benjamin Percy from a decision somebody else made, and I was very lucky because he's so good, and we got along so well, and we worked together so well. And I became a fan of Green Arrow through the process of talking with Ben about the character and what we thought should be expressed about him, and that was a really fun process that Rebirth enabled us to have. Because sort of everything was on the table. We could look at things that you were not able to do, like the Black Canary relationship. And that process repeated itself many times throughout Rebirth, like with Suicide Squad and Aquaman. And
was Ben interested in bringing back Black Canary? I mean, I used to read Green Arrow at times. I didn't even know they were. I mean, I guess I dropped off. Did not even know that Black Canary and Green Arrow, because that couple that's what I know them. When I read, that's my Green Arrow. That there was always
it was a creative decision to not have them together, or even have met through the New 52.
Yeah, and
it was just a creative decision I didn't really like, and I was fortunate to be empowered to reverse it.
And Ben wanted that too.
That Ben was very important to Ben, and if you. And that was the feedback we got from the readers. The book was very successful, and I still weekly get missives from people saying they loved it so much, or they're just discovering it now in the trades or whatever. And the relationship is so core to the character. And I have a pithy sort of one-liner about Green Arrow, which is, I think, Black Canary works without Green Arrow, but Green Arrow doesn't work without Black Canary. And these are the sort of things that you think about when you're trying to create like a new successful iteration of a legacy character.
Mm-hmm.
So Rebirth was really a great opportunity to reintegrate and restore a lot of things that had been lost. Just because of, creative decisions. And sometimes, that's really all it is. Like, when you're working with characters like these, everything is either a good idea or a bad idea. And, it's borne out when you release it and you see what happens,
Mm-hmm. Now, when you came onto DC, there must have been a whole culture that you had to learn, even though you had these conversations, these long conversations with Brian and Bob, just before, for them to decide to bring you on, and they felt that you were a fit. But when you stepped into the offices and you were handed these characters, was there a moment of going, what do I do now? Or was it the transition made did anybody step in and help make that transition to being a comic book editor and shepherding these characters like Suicide Squad and Green Arrow, especially at that time when their, rebirth is kicking in, so there's a ramp up and expectations of these launches and eyeballs on these new launches and these new takes and stuff.
Well, I was fortunate with the timing again because the company was in the middle of moving. So my first days in the LA office, it was really just me and Alex Antone and a few other people because the New York people hadn't arrived yet. So there was a big culture shift right around the time I came in. So I was fortunate in that I didn't really have to conform to some sort of existing way of doing things because we were all sort of reinventing it together. The LA era was beginning.
Did you have to show around all these hardcore New Yorkers that I'll never leave the East Coast? A little, like what LA is all about.
A little bit. Like people in New York were asking me about, where should I live? Tell me about the neighborhoods, things like that. But to answer your question in terms of like helping me, jump in feet first, the person who was most invaluable to me was my then assistant editor, Ariana Totoro. She had been at DC first as an intern and then as an assistant editor in Brian's group and helped me with all the sort of like internal processes, things that you could only learn once you're working there, like the way the paperwork works, the way, this is what this weekly meeting is for. This is what you have to have prepared for this meeting and things like that. In terms of, and I learned a lot from Brian too, in terms of like, do this so you don't get in trouble, like things like that. I was also very excited and naive really about what I thought an editor could do at that time with respect to like logo design or hiring people or coloring the books. And, it's funny. I look back at some of the creative decisions I made. It's funny knowing what I know now, I might not have made them, not as creative decisions on their own merit, but just in terms of like, how much grief you might get for them, because they might not be somebody's tastes or something like that. Because if, sometimes you'll do something and you'll hear about it from somebody above you. And I look back and I think, oh, yeah, of course he wasn't going to like that. Of course they weren't going to like that. Why'd I do that? Well, I didn't know. It was a fun experience for that. So that when Rebirth happened, I was very practiced by that point, and I jumped in to those books, and I think those were very strong by that point. But Ariana was super important to giving me sort of the lay of the land and helping me see the boundaries, in terms of what you could do and in that moment, and not get, in too much trouble for it, basically.
That was one thing, like Bob Schreck, in an old interview of mine, was talking about how he would make pitches and bring up ideas to Karen Berger when he was at Vertigo. And also Will Dennis sort of echoed the same thing, that these two guys and other editors are probably, they knew their boss, they had experience before. So they figured out a strategy of how to sort of convince them to maybe do something that if they had just rushed through the door right away or whatever, a different approach would have gotten them a no. But they figured out approaches that would eventually get them a yes. And stuff, because they just had the opportunity of years of experience of watching. And is that sort of what you're talking about, that you sort of had to, learn how to, just learn when's a good time, how to sort of turn up the heat a little bit, or when to step back and maybe, sit tight on an idea or something before pitching it? Or
in every corporate job, I think in any industry, you really have to learn how and when to present an idea and fight for an idea.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that at first. I made a lot of mistakes at first, and I think that's good too. I think that's the best way to learn. At least the best way for me to learn.
Were those mistakes that you made, did they end up killing the project in total, or were you able to maybe bring them back again after you sort of figured out how to
nothing was ever killed. It's just,
okay.
Like it's hard to give you a specific example without sort of casting aspersions on anybody, because I'm proud of all the work, but there's certain things I did early on that I might not do now, because now I have more experience. I'm better now. I can see in retrospect that maybe something I thought was a good idea at the time isn't a good idea now, or because I knew now in retrospect, I might know, like, of course, the bosses were never going to like that. I might have picked a different moment for that kind of thing, and I'm making it sound like the job is about some sort of I don't know, game of chess, and it's not. It's a fun, creative job, and sometimes you get your way, and sometimes you don't, and sometimes you're wrong. It's not as dire as all that. As a project failing or whatever. I mean, that's, if you're asking about like a pitch, like a take you come up with for a DC character, and you want to do it, and you get told no, that could be a bummer, but that's just the job. It's someone else's job to say yes or say no, and that's just how it is. Sometimes it can be frustrating because you might believe in your heart you're absolutely right, and maybe you're right, but it's still, that's just the way it is,
Well, I mean, the passion you want, a creator wants their editor or producer in film to be as passionate as they are. Because that's what carries, something into fruition. Basically, a pitch is something out of thin air. So if that pitch is able to garner the passion, and sometimes the passion can get that pitch over the finish line with your bosses, because they see how much you believe in it too. What do you think? Is that something you looked at or approached, and present in pitching ideas? Of you wouldn't go up to up the ladder unless you really, really felt that this pitch would improve the overall line that was a fit for the family?
I'm focusing on what you said about passion.
Yeah,
I think with your, like, if I felt passionate about something, I definitely felt very empowered to make a case to Brian Cunningham or to my boss, to Mark Doyle, who was my boss later, about things like that. But ultimately, like, the company is going to do what it thinks is best for the company. Like, is this going to be successful? Is this in line with what we want to do? So your passion, I never felt restricted in expressing myself to the bosses, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily matter. It's just, do they agree or not that this is the kind of project we should do? Now, there are many things I got to do because I was able to, I guess I was persuasive, where they agreed. Like, a great example of that is the book Harleen by Stepien Sejic, which was a Black Label miniseries about Harley Quinn, by a guy who had never written anything for DC before, who'd been doing his own indie comics for a long time. And if you're not familiar, he was doing an indie book called Sunstone, which was a lesbian BDSM kind of romantic comedy. I just thought it was such a great comic. The relationships were so vivid and funny and of course sexy. And I knew he had an interest in Harley Quinn, and we developed, a pitch together. And, I remember hearing from somebody above me, them telling me, this is not the sort of thing I think is my cup of tea, but I can see how much you like it, and I can see that people would like it, and I will support you in pushing this. That was Mark Doyle who said that. Mm-hmm. And that was very helpful. And eventually, because at the time we were still trying to figure out the place for it, and I really wanted it to be a Black Label book in the sort of oversized format and prestige format. And eventually I was, I felt empowered to go to Dan DiDio directly and say, I really want to do this book. Will you take a look at these sample pages and just give me the green light or the red light right now? And he said, I think this looks great. Let's go do it. I would say this about Dan DiDio: has a reputation for being mercurial, and that's probably earned. But I think what I really respected about Dan is he was approachable in that way, and he would listen to you. He'd hear you out if you did believe in something. So, now again, passion is not necessarily a deciding factor, but he would recognize it, and he would acknowledge it. And that was a case where I think he and I were just in agreement. Like, this looks like a hit, and it was. And I appreciated that about him. We didn't always agree, but that's just, that's life. Your boss isn't always going to see things your way, and you're not always going to be right.
And that was when Black Label was just beginning, right? It was just...
That was an early Black Label.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It hasn't sort of solidified the way it has now and actually become, oh, wow, this is really a success. When I heard the first pitch about Black Label, I'm like, I can come back to DC and I don't have to spend months reading comics, and I can, this stuff is has a little more edge to it. And the takes are like, oh wow, this take is great, this take looks great, and the quality is just amazing overall on the whole label. It just seems like everybody's game is upped a bit when they're on that imprint.
There were a lot of conversations about what that was and wasn't, and for whatever reason, I'm not sure, it became sort of locked in people's imaginations that the line would be a mature reader's line with DC characters. And that was never in my, and I was part of, inventing it. That was never like a thing, it was, some of them would be mature, but mostly they were going to be self-contained and prestige, if you like. Something like Darwin Cook's The New Frontier, had it been created in that window of time, would have been a Black Label book, and it's hardly a mature reader's book. You know what I mean? So,
but the themes and what he's dealing with, the complexity of that, there's a complexity in it that you don't sometimes get on like monthly series.
I mean, sure, you can make that argument.
I think I don't know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
but what I mean is, it's not, particularly violent or sexual or anything like that. Now, some of them were, but it wasn't, the blanket sort of mission statement there. So this is why also like one of the things we talked about is Black Label just for the Frank Millers of the world, or the Raphael Grandpas of the world, or the Brian Azzarellos and Lee Bermejos of the world, or as it could be for somebody like Sejic, who is just a really good and someone we think is fantastic and would really fit in this format. Like those are the kinds of conversations you have when you're developing an initiative like that. And it ended up being sort of a hybrid. It was what we thought, deserved to be presented in this way. It seemed like something very elevated and something, creator driven and holistic, like a vision, with beginning, middle, and end. And which is not to say there were, I don't know if there have been, but I know when I was there, we talked about, certain things could be series of Black Label graphic novels, basically, like a Harleen sequel, for example, So that was a really exciting time, and I really loved working on all the Black Label books I worked on. In fact, there are still some that I left unfinished that are still going to come out.
Oh, nice.
Even years after I've left the company, because there's a long runway for some of those, because you're working with people who need a lot of time to do some very intricate, labor-intensive work.
Oh, it's all on the page. I mean, I haven't, what I've gone through, but like the Greg Smallwood Human Target. I can't wait to get the hardcover version of that. I'm waiting for this one. I mean, all this stuff, even, the Wonder Woman Dead Earth. I mean, everything it's right there. It's all on the page. It just seems like on these Black labels, was it labor of love for these creators too, of being able to play in this universe, but also in their vision, to really let loose with their vision on these series.
You mentioned Wonder Woman Dead Earth. That was a case of I felt very empowered to show this guy's art, Daniel Warren Johnson's art, to Jim Lee and say, this guy has never done like a big Marvel book. He's never done anything for DC. He's just done these crazy image books. He does these crazy commissions, and I just think he's fantastic, and I would love to do a Black label book with him, even though he's not like a quote-unquote big name yet. And Jim said, I agree. This guy looks amazing. See what you could develop together. And we came up with Wonder Woman Dead Earth. I mean, he came up with it. He came in with this idea. We batted around a little bit, and then we just sent him off to do it. And that book came together very quickly. Was almost fully formed in his imagination when he pitched it. Sometimes things don't need years and years to percolate. Sometimes, doing them very quickly can be advantageous, because I think you see that on the page of that book. It just seems so alive and fresh, and because he was like laying the tracks as the train was moving on that one. We knew where it was going to end. We knew the story and everything like that, but we were very aggressive with the scheduling on that one, and he rose to the occasion. But yeah, you tell creators, like, look, you're not restricted by canon exactly. Like we did at least when I was there, we imposed this sort of notion that the version of the character you're using has to be sort of recognizably that character in sort of a classic way. Like the Wonder Woman character in Wonder Woman Dead Earth, even though she's in a completely new environment and scenario, it's still recognizably Wonder Woman. In The Dark Knight Returns, it's still Batman. He's just older. It's not like an Elseworlds where, Superman is like Robin Hood or whatever the twist might be.
That would be Green Arrow.
Yeah, exactly. Like these are still basically who they are, but because the idea also was like a book market push. You want people in the bookstores and on Amazon to be able to like confidently buy a story about Wonder Woman or Batman and have some sort of background knowledge of them in the way that most people who consume pop culture do, and not feel adrift.
And you're not saying that none of that happened. You're not saying that none of this continuity and all this background information you might have picked up didn't happen. But here's a character that you're very familiar with that all that stuff did happen to, in a different story, in a different setting, different challenges that might reveal something that hasn't been really developed or, really revealed before, or an aspect of character that hasn't really been challenged. You can, as a reader, like for me, I can go into a Black label and I have, a lifetime of history with these characters, and it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm being, everything's being thrown out the window. I can take all that baggage with me and have a great time.
Well, that was certainly a goal when I was there with Mark Doyle to make sure that it did feel like that. It is something you recognize, but could also tell a story that maybe isn't restricted by the confines of a shared universe book where things can't really end. Things can't really be broken because these stories have to keep going and going. Harleen's a good example of what you were just saying, like the angle that was different about Harleen was, I don't think we really saw a story before that was the why of Harley. We know what happened to Harley, but we didn't know why this woman fell in love with the Joker. How did that happen? And this is the story of how that actually happened. And it's very tragic and romantic, and it's something you can't really do in the main line because Harley and the Joker are split up in the main line, and they have been for a very long time. And that version of Harley is off and running and has been very successfully for a long time. So this gave us a way to tell a story that doesn't interfere with that, but is also fills in a gap in a really strong, dramatic way. And the book was very successful. So that was a really rewarding experience for sure. All the Black Label experiences have been super rewarding for sure, as were Rebirth. Like that was a great, for me personally anyway, that was just a great run of projects.
And here's the second and final addendum, where Andy talks about some unsung heroes at DC Comics.
Besides Mike Harlan and Mark Chiarello, there were just so many, at the time I got there, just really long tenured comic book professionals in this, the sales department, collected editions, design, who had been in and out of DC Comics for decades, that were just so helpful to me in giving me advice, giving me feedback on my ideas. A great example is Kenny Lopez, who's the head of covers and logos. I came in not really knowing that editors at that time anyway don't really get involved in logos. I just assumed they did. So I came in with a lot of ideas, and this is one of those things I was mentioning, like things I know now that I probably wouldn't do, but when you come in new and naive, and of course your bosses aren't even in the state, you can just kind of go for it. And Kenny and I did many logos together, and I just learned so much from him. And another great DC veteran was Amy Metcalf, who's a great designer, art director. She did so many things at the company, like back in the 90s through now. Now she does collected editions, but she used to do house ads and logos. And I loved walking over into the design team area that was, Mark Chiarello's area, and also collected editions. He was in charge of it at the time, and just talking and learning. And I just felt this is such a great job, because you can just walk around the building and find people who are just amazing at what they do and collaborate with them. And, I was sort of surprised to learn at the start that this was not something that people did that often. There was some, in like in a lot of corporations, there was a lot of sort of, separation of church and state between departments. And I don't like that. And I made it my business to try to make, working relationships and friendships with anybody who I respected and wanted to work with. And I'm just really so glad, there's so many great people at DC. That are not really visible to the readers. Like one person I can think of is Allison Rudolph, who's a proofreader who I worked with quite a lot. Like a lot of people might think editors do the copy editing, but I mean, we do that as a matter of course, but really everything ultimately goes through Allison and Brett. And Allison was someone I worked with particularly often, and just, she comes from prose. She was a book editor, like with real books, and just somebody who gives incredible feedback, incredible advice, and works incredibly hard. There's so many people in the production department, people who make sure the books get manufactured properly, and who source the paper, especially these days when there's such a shortage. Like there's so many super talented, hardworking people there, and I loved working in the comic book factory. Like it was fantastic. I haven't even mentioned all the fantastic editors there. I was really lucky, to collaborate with some fantastic people, most of them much younger than me, who I learned a lot from, and who, tolerated a lot of my, I guess, eccentricities. And they're really good friends now. Like I haven't been at the company since late 2020, and I still talk to my old colleagues literally every day. Like my friend and former colleague Chris Conroy is someone who's been working at DC for almost 20 years in different roles, and he confirmed for me that the LA group of that big chunk of time, between the LA move and the pandemic, was just a really strong group of people. I see, the work they're doing now, and I'm just you know, I have a lot of FOMO about it, but it's great. Like, I think under the leadership of Marie Javins, the current editor-in-chief, the editors have really been empowered to drive the line in a really modern way that I think nails that balance I mentioned before, which is you want to present the characters and the stories and the concepts in a really, I think, thoroughly modern way, but that also feels familiar to the core of the character or the concept and what people love about it. You know, like that's, at least as far as I'm concerned, that's always the real trick. And when I look at the work I did at DC, I think for the most part, that's what I did and always tried to do, which was, you know, imagine what would, for example, Suicide Squad, you know, the Suicide Squad run that I worked on with Rob Williams and Jim Lee and John Romita and, you know, Jason Fabok and Tony Daniel and Yvonne Rees and so many great, because we had so many cool backups. Like that was just like a killer, amazing, star-studded book to work on. And I just felt like this is what Suicide Squad should be like in this moment, you know, as opposed to trying to replicate the 80s Suicide Squad or reinvent it completely or something like that. You know, like you really want to find that sweet spot between old and new. And I think what the current group of editors are doing and the current line reflects that pretty flawlessly. I mean, I can't claim to have read everything, but when I just look at the line, the range of things, I'm just incredibly impressed.